What were you thinking just a second ago? In other words, what was the last thought you had in your head right before you hit play? You could have been thinking about your football parlay, maybe how controversial this episode's going to be. Maybe it was something completely unrelated. Doesn't matter what it was. What matters is that thought didn't arrive because you summoned it. You didn't order that thought like it was DoorDash. It just showed up, uninvited. It arrived because something underneath your awareness produced it. Whatever it was, hold on to it, because we're going to come back to it. Because today we're talking about justice, and whether justice even makes sense if free will is fake. This is chapter 5 in this cumulative series, which means by now we already have a foundation. Natural rights exist, moral boundaries exist, coercion is the red moral line, and force is only justified in response to force. In this chapter, I'm going to attempt to establish a baseline for justice. And I'm going to do it using my standard Miyagi-Do approach, where these concepts might sound unrelated, but it is a wax-on, wax-off strategy. Okay, so let's start off by defining justice like adults. Justice is a broad term. At the most basic level, people are held accountable for what they do. Consequences match actions. Rewards match merit. Punishment matches wrongdoing. Later on in the series, we'll touch on distributive justice, restorative justice, and maybe some other categories. But today, I'm not covering the modern progressive justice cinematic universe. Not social justice, not environmental justice, not intersectional justice, and not the patriarchy did it. We are dealing with the primitive core of the word, punishment proportionate to the harm. Justice requires accountability, proportionality, consequences, and the restoration of moral balance. Without accountability, justice becomes nothing more than virtue signaling. And yet, increasingly, we're told by academics, researchers, and activists that accountability itself is outdated. They claim that free will is an illusion. Humans are just biology plus environment. Therefore, blame makes no sense. Therefore, punishment, especially retribution, has no moral foundation. I am giving this worldview a name in my foundational series. I call it the no-blame school. And before I dismantle the conclusions, I'm going to do something most people don't. I'm actually going to give them their due and give their objection the respect it deserves. So let's talk about free will. And full disclosure, I went to a private school before college. Catholic school. And yeah, I know how that sounds, but at least where I went, critical thinking was actually encouraged, which is probably why, unsurprisingly, I spent half my time arguing with priests, nuns, and religion teachers. Christian theology teaches that free will is essential, and that humans are morally responsible because they can freely choose to obey or disobey God, and that freedom is essential for sin and moral responsibility. But even as a teenager, I didn't buy this. I argued with the religion teachers. I said, that doesn't logically work with the kind of God you're describing. If God is omniscient, if God knows all future events, then God knew what you would do before you were created. If God is also the creator, then he designed your genetics, your temperament, your predispositions, and placed you in a specific environment at a specific time. If he knew the outcome before creation, then the outcome was never uncertain. If your actions were certain, then you could not have done otherwise. And if you could not have done otherwise, then you do not have free will. So, in general, my conclusion was simple. If God is omniscient and the creator, humans do not have free will. Let me reframe this in a simpler form. Imagine I'm an engineer and I build a robot. This robot moves like a knight in chess. Forward 2 feet, left 1 foot. Forward 2 feet, left 1 foot. And it repeats. Now, I set a narrow wood plank bridge across a creek. I release the robot on the plank. It will walk and walk and walk, and then it'll step right off and splash into the water. When it does, should I be surprised? Can I blame the robot? No. It's executing programming. I designed it. I knew the outcome. I set the conditions. So, if I design the robot to fail under those conditions, I don't get to act morally offended when it fails. Now, let's adapt that thinking onto God and humans. If God created humans with predispositions, then placed them into conditions and knew exactly what they would do, then punishing them like they had full independent choice is logically flawed. The same logic applies to Lucifer. If you believe angels exist, then God built Lucifer. God could have built him with less pride, more empathy, less aggression, whatever. But if God built Lucifer, knowing Lucifer would fall, and that he would end up sending him to hell for all eternity, where's the free choice? Where's the free will? Lucifer acted exactly as God built him to act. There was nothing Lucifer could have done that was different from what God knew he was going to do by building him that way. Anyway, that's basically my theological counter-argument for free will. This appears to be a pretty problematic argument for Christians as it makes God seem sadistic. And it only gets worse when I started studying physics and science. If subatomic particles obey physical laws, then matter behaves according to cause and effect. If the brain is made of matter, then the brain activity obeys cause and effect. If thoughts arise from brain activity, then thoughts obey cause and effect. And if thoughts, decisions, and actions are determined by prior states, then humans do not freely choose their actions. Now, set religion and science aside for a second and just use self-observation. Remember that thought you had before you hit play? The one I told you to remember? Ask yourself, did you choose to think it, or did it just pop into your head uninvited? If you're honest with yourself, I think you know the answer. Try this for 10 seconds. Don't think about a zebra. Go. A black and white striped zebra. Don't think about it. That didn't work, did it? Your mind doesn't ask permission. Thoughts emerge. They just pop in your head, constantly. Every thought you have, every second, is being pushed into your consciousness. You witness them, which leads to an uncomfortable realization. You are not the author of every thought. You are more like an observer of a system in motion. Look, free will is comforting, I get it. But come on, at a basic level, it should be intuitive that people don't control what enters their consciousness. You can't tell me what you're going to be thinking 30 seconds from now, 2 minutes from now, 5 minutes from now, 1 hour from now, because you're not directly steering thought traffic like you're operating a remote control. Okay, now you might be thinking, okay, sure, thoughts pop up, but what about reasoning? What about deliberation? Well, nothing really changes. When you reason, your brain subconsciously runs those calculations. Like a calculator, you press buttons, you get a result. Your brain processes inputs according to rules, logic rules, experience, beliefs, moods, instincts. And your conscious mind does not freely choose those inputs. You do not freely choose the rule set for that processing. Your upbringing, environment, genetics, random life events, they shape your processing from birth. This is backed by science. And I have a little anecdote for you. My mother used to tell the story about my birth. It has to do with swaddling. This is when you wrap baby newborns snugly, womb-like. It's supposed to calm them down. Evidently, the nurses tried it on me. Apparently, I was fine until they wrapped me. Then I started screaming like a banshee. My mom was like, "What the hell's going on?" The nurse said, "Don't worry, he'll calm down." They started a timer. 2 minutes later, still screaming. So they unwrapped me. I calmed down instantly. That's because some babies find swaddling to be heavenly comfort. Me, it was hell in a blanket. We know from day one babies react differently to the same stimuli. That's biology. That's wiring. Before culture, before education, before politics, before any of that nonsense, there is your biology. Now let's take another example that I've heard you use when talking about free will, and that is chocolate or vanilla ice cream. Which one do you prefer? Your choice comes from preferences you didn't pick, your mood you didn't pick, associations you didn't pick, biology you didn't pick. True free will would mean that you could choose preferences independently of all causes. But that's not the case, because in reality, your choices emerge from a web of causes you didn't author. You don't really choose what you prefer at any given moment. The fact that you make a choice based on what you're craving and how much you crave it is different. And here's another little interesting tidbit. Studies show hungry people reason differently than full people. There's even that famous research about judges making harsher decisions when hungry or before lunch versus after lunch. The hungrier the judge was, the more likely the defendant was going to be charged with guilty. Which basically means when you go to court, your liberty might depend on someone's blood sugar or some other non-conscious factors. So I don't know that I'd call that free will. Before we continue to talk about free will and responsibility, let me give you a clear, albeit simplistic, mental model of how action actually happens. Human behavior or actions do not originate or come from a single source. It emerges from 3 interacting layers. We have the non-conscious systems, such as hormones, fatigue, stress, that sets our physical state. Then there are the subconscious systems. This is your instinct, emotion, and pattern recognition that evaluate what matters and what doesn't. And riding atop these 2 is consciousness. This is the part of you that reasons, pauses, resists, redirects, and ultimately chooses. Biology sets the conditions, instincts assign urgency, and the consciousness authorizes action. With that framework in mind, let me give you a scenario of what happens when you meet someone at a bar. This perspective doesn't deny cause and effect, it doesn't reject biology, and it doesn't pretend that human behavior floats free of physics. Anyway, imagine you're sitting in a tavern, and you're talking to somebody at the bar. Everything you know about this person comes entirely from observation. You hear them speak. You watch them gesture. You see how they react. You see them hesitate, choose, respond. From your perspective, you are interacting with a whole human being, a thinking agent, a person. Now, imagine somebody leans over to you and reminds you, hey, free will is an illusion. That human you're engaged with is just reacting to stimuli almost instantaneously. Suddenly, the frame shifts. You realize that what you're interacting with, in a sense, is a human puppet. The puppet lifts its glass when it gets thirsty. The puppet laughs at a joke. The puppet leans in, pulls back, argues, agrees, decides. From the outside, it still looks like the puppet's in control, but behind the scenes, there's a puppeteer. That puppeteer isn't a ghost or some soul floating outside the body. It's the subconscious system, that fast, automatic layer that evaluates the world before conscious thought ever begins. It scans instantly for facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, social cues, signs of stability or volatility. It's not asking, is she good? Instead, it's asking, is this safe enough? This is threat detection, not paranoia. Is she deceptive? Is she unstable? Is she hostile? Is she violating norms? Is she likely to cause future harm, whether it be social, legal, or emotional? Subconscious is driving things like emotional reactions, instinctive pattern recognition, learned associations, attraction and aversion, threat and reward evaluation. This system doesn't speak in words, it doesn't explain itself, it simply pulls or it strongly influences. If something feels unstable, deceptive, or risky, the subconscious applies the brakes. And because the puppet doesn't see the strings being pulled, it feels like it's acting freely. But there's another layer that people usually miss, and that's the strings themselves. Those strings represent non-conscious systems. Hormones, fatigue, hunger, stress, pain, arousal, illness. These systems don't evaluate meaning. They don't generate motives. They don't decide anything. But they do determine how steady the puppet's movement is, how much effort control requires, how easy or difficult restraint becomes. This is kind of like the hungry judge sending people to jail example. These non-conscious systems definitely influence, but it doesn't determine what will actually happen. So, as you're staring at that human puppet, you must realize that you are a puppet too. You don't choose the thoughts that appear. You don't consciously author every impulse. You don't decide which emotions fire first. Much of what moves you happens below the level of awareness. So yes, at the deepest mechanical level, behavior is determined. But here's what the framing does not mean. It does not mean the puppet is fake. It does not mean that the performance is meaningless. And it does not mean responsibility evaporates. Because the puppet still pauses. It resists. It redirects. It still chooses among alternatives presented to it. The puppeteer proposes or influences. The strings constrain. But consciousness authorizes action. That's where restraint lives. That's where judgment lives. That's where accountability lives. At the conscious level. Your conscious mind is where reason is compared. Consequences are simulated. Rules are applied. And actions are chosen. This is where agency lives. Alright, before we go any further with this bar scenario, I want to give you a quick overview of neurotransmitters and hormones. Neurotransmitters are the brain's fast text messages. They're chemicals that let brain cells talk to each other in real time, firing, stopping, adjusting behavior second by second. Hormones are longer lasting settings. They move through the bloodstream. Not just the brain, they shape the conditions under which emotions and behavior happen, like mood, energy, arousal, aggression, bonding, the whole emotional kit and caboodle. Now, I'm not going to take a deep medical dive here, but I want to cover 5 neurotransmitters that come up frequently so you can actually understand what is happening. First, there's dopamine, which influences motivation and reward. This fires when you anticipate something worth pursuing, like landing a deal, chasing a goal, leveling up in a game, or even seeing a notification you've been waiting for on your phone. It's the go-get-it signal. Then, there's serotonin, which influences your calm and stability. This kicks in when things feel settled and regulated. Sitting content after a good meal, feeling respected, feeling socially secure. It's the you're okay signal. Then there's adrenaline. This influences fear and excitement. This fires when a car swerves into your lane, when someone jumps out and startles you, or when you step onto a stage and your heart starts racing. It's the ignition switch for fight or flight. Then we have oxytocin. This influences bonding and trust. This releases during a hug, intimacy, holding your child, or sharing a moment of genuine connection. It's the I feel close to you signal. And lastly, we have endorphins. This influences pain relief and post-struggle reward. These kick in after a hard workout, a tough run, or pushing through discomfort and realizing that didn't kill me and it felt good afterwards. It's why effort can feel meaningful. Now, add on hormones like testosterone, estrogen, and cortisol, which influence confidence, aggression, competitiveness, stress, and threat sensitivity, and voila. Now you have a basic understanding of the concept people use to argue that you're nothing more than a biochemical machine reacting to stimuli. So back to our human puppets at the bar. The no free will determinist will argue, if the puppeteer is pulling the strings, then the puppet isn't really doing anything. That may sound plausible until you look at how humans actually behave. Because even with the impulse firing, even with the emotional pulling of the subconscious, even with the chemistry biasing attention, the puppet still performs. And you can see the consciousness everywhere. Let's say the woman says something to offend the guy, to piss him off, and he gets angry. Biologically, outside of his control, his heart rate is up, his jaw tightens, but he doesn't speak immediately. He takes a breath. He looks away. He counts to 3. Nothing stopped the anger, nothing removed the impulse, but the puppet paused. That pause is conscious control inserting time between impulse and action. If the puppeteer were fully in control, that pause would never have happened. Suppose one of you feels a strong urge to check your phone during that important conversation. The dopamine is pooling. You feel the urge clearly, but you don't do it. You keep eye contact. You stay present. No reward disappeared. No chemistry vanished. The puppet resisted the pull from the subconscious. Resisting something you don't feel isn't resistance. Resisting something you do is. Suppose you're an asshole, and the woman feels that bad boy attraction to you that she knows is a bad idea. The chemistry is real. The pull is real. But her conscious mind considers the short-term excitement, the long-term consequences, her existing commitments. She chooses distance instead of pursuit. Multiple options were present, but only one was chosen. That's agency. And now that we're all speaking the same language, let me speak directly to the no-blame school. Do I agree that free will is an illusion? That our brains, thoughts, and feelings operate as a result of cause and effect? That humans are just biology plus environment? Yes, I do. Technically, at the subatomic and molecular level, but that's where it stops. I do not share the conclusion that therefore blame makes no sense, that therefore punishment, especially retribution, has no moral foundation. Because what happens when we apply that same logic, it's just biology, consistently? What happens if we take this no-blame school argument seriously? Let's apply it consistently. If free will is an illusion, if human behavior is nothing more than biology plus environment, then we don't lose just moral responsibility, we lose everything else too. Because free will doesn't selectively disappear only when someone commits a crime. It disappears everywhere. For example, love. Love feels like one of the most personal, intimate, voluntary experiences humans have. Choosing someone, bonding, sacrificing, staying. Under the lens of strict determinism, love isn't a choice at all. It's oxytocin, dopamine, neurotransmitters, and hormonal bonding systems shaped by evolution to promote attachment, pair bonding, and reproduction. If free will is an illusion, then you didn't choose love. Your brain ran a bonding protocol. So tell me, do we really believe love is meaningless just because we understand the chemistry? What about anger? Anger feels deliberate, directed, moral. You crossed the line. But biologically, it's adrenaline, cortisol, testosterone, threat detection, and dominance circuitry activating under perceived violation. If free will is an illusion, then anger isn't a moral reaction, it's just a stress response. So when someone gets angry at injustice, are they irrational or are they just biologically correct? What about forgiveness? It's supposed to be noble, hard, voluntary. It often requires suppressing rage, overriding instinct, and letting go of grievance. But if free will doesn't exist, forgiveness is just an emotional regulation circuit dampening the threat response, neurochemistry calming the nervous system. So when someone forgives you after years of struggle, did they choose grace? Or did their brain finally rebalance? And if it's the latter, do we really want to say forgiveness is an illusion? What about your goals and ambitions? The drive to build something, to work late, to sacrifice comfort for a future goal. Under determinism, they're dopamine loops, status drives, evolutionary signaling for competence and survival advantage. That startup you built, that career you chased, sorry, you didn't choose it, your biology did. What about courage? It feels like a decision, running toward danger, standing your ground, acting despite a fear. But if free will is an illusion, courage is just a stress response interacting with temperament, conditioning, and prior exposure. So that person who jumps in a river to save a stranger, do we give them the medal, or do we congratulate their neurons? And finally, let's talk about happiness, since we're always talking about the pursuit of happiness. Research suggests that roughly 50% of baseline happiness is genetically influenced, with the rest shaped by the environment and circumstances. So even happiness, the thing we all chase, isn't fully chosen. If free will is an illusion, then you didn't choose happiness either. You experienced it when the conditions allowed. So let's be honest about where all this leads. If free will is an illusion, then love is an illusion. Anger, fear, forgiveness, ambition, courage, happiness, all illusions. And if everything meaningful is an illusion, then the word illusion has just lost its meaning. And here's the part the no-blame school doesn't seem to understand or never wants to admit. Explaining a mechanism doesn't erase meaning. Chemistry does not negate value. Biology does not nullify responsibility. And understanding how something happens does not tell you how society should respond to it. We treat love as real, courage as admirable, forgiveness as virtuous, and betrayal as wrong, even though we know the biology. Don't get me wrong. I do think it's important to understand human nature and how it works. This whole series is built upon acknowledging that humans are constrained by our nature to a large degree. Our sense of justice tied to our natural rights are innate. Our desire to bond is innate, and the social and legal systems we set up can either support our human nature or fight it, can either incentivize the best in our nature or the worst. So no, I'm not denying the science. I'm denying the category error, which I'll explain in a couple minutes. Humans may be deterministic systems at a molecular level, but justice does not operate at the molecular level. It operates at the level of action, behavior, harm, protection, and boundaries. And the moment you pretend otherwise, your entire moral system collapses. Now, let's stay in that tavern for a moment and watch how this actually plays out when things go well for you. If no threat is detected, something changes. The brakes release. Now, dopamine begins to fire. Curiosity, pursuit. This might be worth exploring. Then, through eye contact, laughter, warmth, proximity, your oxytocin starts to rise. Oxytocin doesn't say, she's a great partner. It says, lower your defenses. That's it. It opens the door. It doesn't decide whether you walk through it. You are now paying more attention to her than the room. Background noises fade. Time compresses. That's dopamine at work. The subconscious is saying, this matters. As the conversation flows, there's warmth and ease. Eye contact holds. Laughter comes naturally. But even as your defenses soften, your judgment doesn't disappear. You still notice what she says. You still track how she reacts. You still register alignment or misalignment. You ask yourself, is she aligned with my values? Is this wise? Is this a short or long-term thing? Am I being reckless or deliberate? This is where agency lives. The puppeteer proposes, the strings affect the steadiness, but the puppet still performs the act, and that's why responsibility still exists. Philosophers call this agency, which I hate as a word because it invites semantic nonsense when dealing with academia. But here's what it basically means. Acting intentionally, controlling actions based on motives, and being held accountable assuming you acted freely and intentionally. So yes, at the deepest level, behavior is determined. But even if that model is true, the human as a whole is the thing we interact with. While we might interface with a puppet, we're not talking to the puppeteer. You don't hold conversations with dopamine molecules. You interact with a human as a whole, which includes the puppet and the puppeteer. And that level is where life happens. And that's why, when we zoom back out, humans are black box systems. So bear with me. Here's my alternative way of explaining this. And I'm going to use systems engineering principles to do this. Any system can be analyzed in two ways. You can white box it, which means breaking it down into components, mechanisms, and internal processes. Or you can black box it, where you ignore the internals and focus on the inputs, outputs, behavior, and interfaces. Engineers do both, depending on the problem they're solving. Think about a car. If we black box the car, we fixate on how we interface with that car. We focus on the inputs and outputs. You don't need to know or worry about every little part inside, or how the car was engineered, or the physics involved in its operations. You're treating the car as an entity, as a whole. The only thing you need to know is how to interface with the car as a black box. How to fuel the car by putting gas in the car. That the key starts the car. That the steering wheel turns the car. Brake slows the car. That pressing down on the accelerator pedal moves the car, and so forth. That's what you care about from a practical perspective, how you interface with the car and how it reacts. If we white box the car, we break it down into components. The engine, transmission, axles, brake systems, the tires, electronics, and so forth. We can take any one of these components and break it down again into subcomponents. So let's take the tires, for example. We can break it down into tread, the sidewall, the belts, and the bead. We can continue to decompose or white box down to the molecular level of the materials. At that level, everything has a cause and effect explanation in line with deterministic laws of physics and science. Everything obeys physics. Now let's apply that to humans. White box a human, and what do you see? Neurons, neurotransmitters, genetics, trauma, hormones, conditioning. And yes, at that level, everything looks deterministic, just chemistry and cause and effect. But humans do not live at the molecular level. We live at the human level, at the black box level. And this is where the no-blame school screws up. The no-blame school commits the same category error. A category error happens when you take something that belongs in one level or category of explanation and try to use it to answer a question that belongs in another level, and the answer stops making sense. If I ask, why did the car crash? A behavior or responsibility level answer would be, the driver ran a red light. The component or mechanism level answer would be, the driver's visual system processed the light, the prefrontal cortex failed to inhibit action, dopamine weighed reward prediction overrode caution, and motor neurons executed acceleration. You could break it down further into subcomponent and physical levels. Neurons fired, ions crossed membranes, neurotransmitters bound to receptors, and muscle fibers contracted. All three descriptions are true, but here's the key. Only the first one answers the question of responsibility. If someone responds, you can't blame the driver, it was just neurons firing, that is not disproven responsibility. They have changed the explanatory levels, and that is a category error. The no-blame school of thought whiteboxes humans down to neurons, neurotransmitters, genetics, trauma, hormones, conditioning, then declare morality is meaningless because they dismantle the level where morality operates. At the white box or component level, everything is deterministic. But again, humans do not live at the molecular level. We live at the human black box level. You don't get to say, it wasn't me, it was my neurons. That's confusing explanation with exoneration. Society doesn't function at the molecular level either, nor does justice operate at the neurotransmitter level. They also operate at the black box level, the human level. Action, choices, harm, victims, and boundaries. Because it has to. The moment you pretend otherwise, you don't get compassion. You get ridiculous chaos. Because when someone runs red light and kills a family, we don't say, well, technically, it was combustion chemistry and torque transfer. We say the driver is responsible. Not because physics is false, but because responsibility operates at the behavioral level, not the component level. Explanation does not negate function. Knowing how memory works doesn't make memories unreal. Knowing how vision works doesn't make sight an illusion. Knowing how engines work doesn't make driving fictional. Likewise, knowing how decisions arise biologically doesn't erase responsibility. Knowing behavior is caused doesn't tell you how society must respond to harm. Justice is a human-level system, not a molecular one. So free will, from a technical perspective at the molecular level, may truly be an illusion. But morality and justice exist at the human level, at the action level. Now let's attack the other argument from the no-blame school. They argue if free will is an illusion, then blame makes no sense. Punishment should not be about what someone deserves. Justice should only be about prevention, rehabilitation, and future outcomes. They believe that if someone's actions are dictated by factors outside their control, then punishing them for those actions is as unfair as punishing someone for the color of their skin or their genetic makeup. To them, a violent criminal or killer isn't a bad person. They are a product of biology and environment, shaped by forces they did not choose. So the justice system should address the cause of the behavior, mental illness, poverty, lack of education, instead of inflicting suffering on someone who couldn't help it. But here's the problem they never answer. What about the victim? Not society, not statistics, the victim. When you tell the victim, we're not punishing the person who harmed you, we're just going to manage them, you're really telling them that your suffering is secondary. That destroys moral legitimacy, and it's catastrophically disconnected from human nature. It's the same mistake they made in that classic movie called A Clockwork Orange. The belief that you can chemically or behaviorally condition away moral agency and still call it justice. You might get compliance, you might get control, but what you don't get is a moral balance, and everybody knows it. Because humans, especially men, but not only men, possess deep, involved instincts for fairness, reciprocity, and retaliation when moral boundaries are violated. Call it retribution, call it vengeance, call it restoring balance. Doesn't matter. Either way, this genetic ancient software is in our nature. And if a justice system refuses to satisfy that instinct, you don't get peace. You get vigilantism, you get resentment, and you get a collapse of legitimacy of our justice system. Not because people are barbaric, because they are human. And when that balance is denied, humans do what humans have always done. They take matters into their own hands. Justice is not about safety. It's about moral balance. And that's exactly what is illustrated in A Clockwork Orange. In that movie, Alex is subjected to reconditioning after being convicted of murder. More specifically, Alex and his gang break into the home of a writer and his wife. They rape and brutally assault the wife. Alex participates and leads the attack, famously singing in the Rain. The wife later dies from her injuries. Alex is arrested, tried, and sentenced to 14 years in prison for murder. When incarcerated, Alex volunteers for an experimental Ludovico technique, a form of aversion therapy which conditions him to feel intense nausea and pain at any thought of violence, even sex. This reforms him, not by moral growth, but by removing his capacity to choose evil at all. Now, the husband, the writer, perceives the state's response as a profound moral failure, not justice. After his wife is raped and dies, Alex's later reform doesn't bring him peace. It enrages him. Seeing his wife's attacker released and chemically conditioned convinces him that the system erased accountability instead of honoring the harm. His grief transforms into obsession, and he ultimately seeks vengeance, because the justice system never restored moral balance. That reaction is the point. When justice feels hollow to victims, they don't heal, they radicalize. So here's the logical trap the no-blame school must address. If free will is an illusion, then every action is biology and environment. So if you excuse the criminal, you must also excuse the husband, the man who retaliates when justice fails. That rage is also biology. The moment you punish one but excuse the other, you admit the truth. Accountability still exists at the behavioral level. You don't get to toggle it on and off for ideology. Now, let's talk about what doesn't disappear under the no-blame school determinism. Your biological protective instinct, your evolutionary psychology, your human nature. Before justice was a concept, it was a reaction. At the biological level, the sense of justice is not just one thing. It's a cluster of instincts that activate when natural right boundaries are violated. When someone is harmed, cheated, attacked, or violated, their brain reacts instantly. The amygdala detects threat and violation. The anterior insula generates disgust and moral revulsion. Stress hormones mobilize action. This is why injustice feels physically wrong. Justice doesn't begin with reasoning. It begins with, this should not have happened. That reaction shows up when you're the victim, when someone you care about has been harmed, even when a stranger is treated unfairly. That's not ideology. That's threat detection generalized to social life. We saw this in the previous chapter in game theory. Humans are a reciprocal species. Even other primates. We see the punishment of cheaters, anger at freeloaders, retaliation for betrayal, preference for proportional responses. Neurologically, unfairness activates the insula, the prefrontal cortex, the dopamine suppression. In plain terms, unfairness feels bad because it threatens cooperation. Justice evolved to restore balance, not to enforce equality or virtue. That's why an eye for an eye feels intuitive. Too little response invites repeated harm. Too much response triggers escalation. Proportionality is the stability mechanism. When someone violates a core natural rights boundary, violence, theft, coercion, abuse of children, the brain generates anger, disgust, and a desire for punishment. This serves two biological purposes. One, deterrence. It signals, don't do this. Two, a reaffirmation, reinforcing shared natural rights boundaries. Groups without this response don't stay groups for long. This is why societies that refuse to punish serious harm will eventually see vigilantism, cycles of revenge, and a breakdown in trust. Justice is the civilized replacement for blood feuds, and our brains are especially sensitive to unanswered victimization. When harm occurs and no response follows, stress remains elevated, trauma persists, rage festers. From a biological standpoint, unpunished harm signals the boundaries are meaningless. That's why purely technocratic justice, or just managing the risk, fails. It ignores the victim's nervous system. Retributive justice doesn't just exist to satisfy cruelty, it exists to close the loop. To tell a victim that harm was real, that boundary mattered, and the system recognized it. That restores the psychological equilibrium, not just social order. Okay, now it's time to address or speak to my Christian friends, because this is where they historically fail. They confuse sin with crime, and that single error has done more damage to justice than almost anything else. Sin is a matter between a person and God. Crime is a matter between one person and another person's natural rights. Scripture is actually very clear about this jurisdiction, even if the modern Christian pretends it isn't. Who are you to judge your neighbor? Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. These aren't poetic suggestions. These are boundary lines. God judges sin. Humans judge harm. When Christians forget that distinction, they don't create morality, they create tyranny. If you go back in time 50 years ago, when this Christian thinking found it acceptable to place into law punishment for victimless crimes, whether it was being a homosexual or smoking marijuana or what have you, it created a sense of injustice, which created more atheists, more progressives, more socialists, who found disgust in the Christian moral principles. Punishing people for victimless crimes is violating someone's natural rights. And when Christians forget that distinction, they don't create morality, they create tyranny and resentment. And furthermore, let's talk about something Christians used to understand very well: proportional justice. The Old Testament principle of an eye for an eye is constantly misunderstood, including by Christians themselves. It was not a call for cruelty, it was a limit on punishment. It meant the response must match the harm. No escalation, no moral theater, no punishment without a victim. An eye for an eye. Not a life for an insult, not prison for personal vice, not state violence for private behavior. Retribution in the biblical sense was about restoring moral balance, not enforcing virtue, not policing thoughts, desires, or consensual acts. This is why victimless crimes are incompatible with Christian justice. If no one's natural rights were violated, no life was harmed, no liberty was coerced, no property was stolen, no child was abused. There's nothing to avenge. No victim, no imbalance, no proportional response is needed. When Christians use the state to punish drugs, consensual sex, private conduct, or personal vice, they're not applying biblical justice. They're playing God. They are substituting disgust for harm, sin for crime, authority for justice. And the scripture explicitly warns against that. And here's the irony Christians never saw coming. The moment you abandon proportional, victim-based justice, you destroy the legitimacy of punishment itself. People stopped seeing the law as protection and started seeing it as oppression. And when that happens, the pendulum doesn't just gently swing back, it snaps hard. Which is exactly why we're in the mess that we are today. So in closing, free will debates can technically be true at the molecular level and still be practically useless at the human level, because humans don't live as neurons. We live as agents. We make choices. We cause harm. We owe restitution. When someone violates natural rights, a justice system has one job: restore moral balance, or the people will do it themselves. I don't care about your genetics. I don't care about your background. I don't care about the environment you were raised in. If you turn into the Joker and you're out to get me, you forced me to become Batman. In the next chapter, we're going to be dealing with another uncomfortable truth. If you accept what I'm saying about natural rights, about proportional justice, about victimless crimes, then the next question isn't philosophical anymore, it's political. Because the only thing standing between your rights and the mob is the structure of government. So let me ask you something. Are you proud to be an American? Well, in the next chapter, we're going to test that answer, so make sure you hit like, subscribe, and hit that little alert bell doohickey, whatever that is, so you can be alerted when I produce these controversial videos. And if you agree with what I'm saying, feel free to send these videos to your friends. I'd be glad to challenge their counter-arguments. But again, just a reminder, this is a cumulative series. If you ask me a question that I've already answered in a previous chapter, I'm just going to point you to that chapter until you actually listen to the entire thing. Don't ask me a question about algebra when you don't know how to add and subtract. And on that obnoxious note, peace out from Virginia.